Good day, everyone. I'm Brian, moderator for this webinar. Welcome everyone for today's webinar, Workplace Unconscious Bias, Minimizing the Impact on Discrimination, Hiring, Promotions, and Retention. I would now like to introduce our presenter for today, Dr. Susan Strauss. Dr. Susan Strauss is a national and international consultant, speaker, and trainer in organizational effectiveness and management development. I would now like to hand over the floor to the speaker. Over to you, Susan.
Well, thank you and welcome everybody. Unconscious bias is a fascinating field. There's just a ton of information about it on the internet. And so with us talking about it for only an hour today, it's barely going to touch the surface. Let's look at the objectives for today. One, we're going to define unconscious bias and what is the impact that it has in the workplace. We're going to explain the relationship between unconscious bias and discrimination, and we're going to explore the role of stereotypes in unconscious bias, and we'll discuss the implicit association test that you can take anonymously and confidentially online. And then we'll look at some of the steps in minimizing unconscious bias. So with that, let's look at the unconscious mental processes. Well, it's what we do systematically to distort the way that we see others. We do it unconsciously. The consequences, however, to unconscious bias are much more major with women and minorities. So let's take a look. When we talk about implicit bias, we're talking about the unconscious. Explicit bias is our conscious bias. So let's look at explicit bias first. These are views and opinions that we are consciously aware of, but our unconscious won't necessarily know what our explicit bias is. We have a conscious brain and a hidden brain. The hidden brain takes over, now this is the important piece, after the rules have been learned. Now, what we do here is that we apply shortcuts to different situations, and they don't always work. So what is unconscious bias? Well, it is referred to as the hidden brain, and it's the part of the brain, again, that functions without our thinking. We're not aware of it when it's unconscious. We might even swear that we are not. Sometimes unconscious bias then is referred to implicit bias, unconscious prejudice, hidden bias, and it can lead us to act in a way that is actually at odds. So it derives its power then from the very fact that we don't know that it's working. Civil rights was passed in 1964. That means next year it will be 60 years since we've had the civil rights law. But look at the inequality we still have in just these few things. Now, your conscious brain is what you are using right now. This is a new situation. It's new information. I'm giving you logic and rationale. The unconscious bias then is what we have traditionally thought when we think of, well, people should just know better than to act that way. And that discrimination was conscious, not unconscious. The amygdala is in the primitive portion of your brain, and it is the part of your brain that deals with emotion. This is how we typically treat them. I'm just going to throw this up on the screen. So let's take a look at this. We have micro acts. We think of them as microaggressions. So these are micro acts referring to people as all people as mankind. And then inappropriate humor regarding any of the protected classes. We do have a shared cultural knowledge in the U.S. So stereotypes then are associated with groups. Therefore, we respond unconsciously to these stereotypes. So the stereotype then is an exaggerated belief about a group or an individual, and it is the basis for discrimination. when we think about what increases our risk of stereotyping, it's anything that taxes our attention. So these things will automatically increase your risk of stereotyping. So all of this is implicit bias. We've got to make sure that we promote counter stereotypical images, or a doctor should be a male, or a nurse should be a female. We've got to counter those stereotypical images. So when we look at all of this, then this is called confirmation bias. All of those things are the same. All right. Now, people may not even notice this implicit bias in themselves. We don't want to hear about anything else. So we tend to believe and recall evidence. Now, warm versus competent. The whole warmth and competency dimension is consistent across all cultures. Now, attractive people, let's look at this one. They are more successful. They're hired sooner. They're promoted quicker. What we're finding out about police officers being as likely to discriminate against Black people as they are against white. Now, what about men's height? Here's another bias. Now, racial stereotypes, unconscious. None of those recruiters were aware of doing that. Now, the Clark doll experiment. This was a study that was done by Dr. Clark and his wife. Now, it was this study that played a role in Brown versus the Department of Education. Now, let's take a look at race. Now, what about women in management? They are in a double bind because there's a backlash effect. So there is a bias against women leaders. And there's something called solos. And women and minorities fall in here. It exacerbates negative stereotypes. So what's a solo? If you have 15% or less of the workforce, you have a solo. So solos, they're distinctive. They're going to stand out, right? Because there's not very many of them. Stereotyped more frequently. Now, these are protected classes. I've thrown most of them up here. So what is the impact then? But also unconscious stereotypes. How can the plaintiff use it if you get sued and being laid off? Who gets laid off or who's going to be fired? Overt discrimination. So these are some examples of a disparate impact that very often becomes subjective. Now, the EEOC has what they call uniform guidelines on employee selection criteria. Now, what's the impact of it on the workplace? So these are all of the ways that it can raise its ugly head. One of the things we might say when we're interviewing is this candidate a fit? And how important is it for you to have people that are in your out group? So how do you overcome these hidden biases? Let's get rid of them. What about being a role model yourself? And there's a good self-check technique. And these are the questions you could ask. These are questions. So how do you combat bias? What about your policies? What else can you do? By conducting the audit of the workplace and a safe environment. So an ineffective diversity program, climate is something everybody talks about. Culture is the unspoken rules. Implicit bias then is distinct from conscious. And that's it. Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for joining us. I hope that this was helpful for you. I hope you have a dandy, good day and a good week. Have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Susan. That does conclude the session for today. Thank you everyone for participating. You may all disconnect now. Have a great day ahead. Bye-bye. Take care.